welcome to today's talk on the future of the BBC. I'm Daniela Kraus, the General Secretary of the Press Club Concordia here in Vienna, and I'm very happy and delighted to welcome our guest, Emily Bell. Hello, Emily.
Hello, thanks very much indeed. I'm so pleased to be here.
Hello. I don't think that I have to make a very long introduction because many people know you as one of the leading media experts, Emily. Emily, you are currently in New York City. You are the director of the Tau Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University Journalism School. As most of you might know, prior to that, Emily was at the board of the Guardian newspapers and was the director of digital content at Guardian News and Media. And actually you built up the digital operations of the Guardian.
That's right. So, quite a long time ago, but yes.
So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. A note to the audience, we will have a recording of this talk and we are also streaming on YouTube. So welcome to everybody on YouTube. Emily and I will have a conversation, let's say 25 to 30 minutes, and then the floor is open to your questions. And we are looking forward to getting to know what you want to ask and to discuss about the BBC. I don't think that the introduction from my part has to be very long. We all know that the BBC is very important, not only in Great Britain, but all over the world. It's one of the best known brands, I would say, in the media industry. And in January 22, the government in the UK announced a 2-year freeze of the BBC license fee, rather than raising it in line with the inflation, and its possible abolishment of the fee in 2027. So
2027, yeah.
2027. So, and this might be seen as an attack on the BBC. So, Emily, my question is, can you just give us a short introduction on the background and the context? What's the government's intention, and what would the consequences be of abolishing the fee?
Sure. Well, as any of you who follow British politics will know, Daniela, the current British government is in a certain state of uproar, and their media policy is no different. So what we had this year was an ad hoc statement pretty much put out on Twitter by Nadine Dorries, who is the minister in charge of media and culture. And it seemed to suggest that the license fee would be over in its current form the next time there's a settlement in 2027, and that there would be the BBC would have to find a different way of raising revenue. Since then, which was all of 3-4 weeks ago, they very much rode back on that position. But actually what is happening has become much clearer, which is there is, as you say, a freeze on the current level of the license fee. And the idea is that the BBC will, the 2027 settlement, it's now not suggested that the BBC license fee will be abolished. But what it has done is open, I think, a front of discussion, which has always been present for the last, perhaps not even 10 years, more like 40 years, about what is the future of the BBC in a highly commercial marketplace. So we know that the license fee, I think everybody is coming to the conclusion that the license fee probably can't continue in its present form. And by that I mean, for people who don't know, it's not a tax revenue that comes directly from the Treasury in the United Kingdom. It's granted by Royal Charter, but it's taken directly from citizens who own a television set. Well, as we know, access to public service broadcasting these days is decreasingly through a TV set. So even if the Conservative government wasn't putting pressure on the BBC to change, there would be some real questions about whether it's actually sustainable in its current form. So we're to say that the BBC is under existential threat is probably going a little bit far. But I think it's fair to say that for the first time in its 100-year history, and it's 100 years old this year, that we are now looking at, perhaps for the first time, the next 10 to 20 years as being ones of really radical change. And we're already seeing that with inflation on the rise and a license fee freeze in place, the BBC is going to be about 30% smaller than it was a decade ago. So actually, in real terms, the BBC is really shrinking at a time when actually international players in this space, and I'm thinking about the big platform companies and the very large media companies that are consolidating in places like the United States, they're all growing. So we stand at a really interesting point.
And so how has the BBC been coping with this pressure or with this development so far? I mean, what has changed? And is the reporting still at the same level as it was, or?
I think that this is a really interesting question, and it's also something which is highly contested. So one thing I would say, and I covered the BBC as a journalist, I've analysed it as a media commentator, and also I work now in an area where I'm often talking to governments about media policy and new media policies, etc. So I've looked at it for a very long time. And it sort of struck me that one of the things that the BBC hasn't had the luxury of doing is really being secure about its own future, and its reporting has become increasingly a political football. And I think you have to contextualize that a little bit. So it still does fantastic reporting. It still has a probably larger number of highly trained journalists, certainly than anywhere in the UK, probably than anywhere in Europe, outside the large, Reuters or something, but that's global rather than, based in one place. And they do fantastic reporting. However, I think that there are stories on which the BBC faltered. And those are pretty well documented. Arguably, Brexit was the most significant of that. I think that people felt that it was such a politically divisive issue, but the economic realities of Brexit were not really communicated particularly well. And when things are not communicated particularly well to the British public, it is a sign of the trust in which the BBC is held that people look to the BBC as being responsible for that. So I feel that you've seen just recently the management of the BBC has produced things like new guidelines for how their journalists should behave on social media. This idea, which is actually now taking hold and being contested in all newsrooms about objectivity, has always been at the centre of the BBC's journalism. In a social media driven world where personality, where we have influencer journalists, and the BBC has a lot of big personalities, how you hold that line of practiced objectivity is becoming more difficult. So I wouldn't say that it's the level of its journalism has declined, but I think it's showing signs of being less assured than it was, and perhaps some signs of being affected by the political pressure.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell us a little bit more about the political pressure? I mean, how does it work? Is it?
I think that we're all experiencing this in different ways around Europe and in the United States, which is, and some of this is to do with our broadcast environment and our media environment. So for 50 years, we enjoyed a pretty stable media landscape where broadcast television news occupied an increasingly large and very stable set of the centre ground. That's where everybody found out about what was going on. And there was a sort of a consensus among journalists, among the mainstream media, about what the main stories were. And then you had, maybe the tabloids producing a sort of more entertaining product. But that was a very identifiable and set pattern. What's happened with social media and social media distribution is that voices on the fringe can actually grow faster and become central to debate pretty easily, particularly if they're not bounded by the requirements of being truthful or the requirements of putting something in proper context, if they're not bounded by having a public service mission behind them. Those voices can grow very large and loud, and they definitely affect not just the debate, but also how the if you like, mainstream journalism is found. And mainstream journalism has become a target for those types of more extreme voices. So we did some research at the Town Centre just before Christmas, where we looked at what was influencing or how right voting, so Republican audiences in the United States, how they were perceiving the news environment. And it's really remarkable that their view of what they regarded as the liberal media, which is not really that liberal, to be honest, in America, was really formed by a consistent narrative coming from particularly Fox News, which is very influential here and very much on the right and moving further right, that actually by including criticism of journalists and describing the mainstream press and making media figures the center of the story, it has eroded trust in that sort of in what we would consider to be mainstream journalism. And it's financially rewarded by the systems that we have at the moment. These places are not financially unsuccessful, they're very successful. So you have a sort of a crisis of trust, you have a crisis of confidence, I think, in mainstream media. And you also have some problems that mainstream media actually created for itself, maybe being not being diverse enough in how it thought about stories, not being perhaps calm enough in how it contextualized issues, chasing too much, audience and commercial success, and not really thinking about keeping its journalism grounded in a way that you would certainly expect public service broadcasters to be. So chasing the market, as the market has become more extreme, the pressure is there to actually follow the market. But the market is being made in things which are not at all helpful to what we would consider to be high quality journalism. I mean, I don't want to be completely pessimistic. If you look at the COVID coverage, one interesting thing that actually happened during the pandemic was, I think when people felt a real existential threat and really needed proper information in time, you did see both viewing and readership figures for high quality news sources going up to historically high levels. And you also saw trust levels going up, particularly in national broadcasters. So the BBC, trust went up in the BBC. It sits at a very high level, between 60 and 70%. That's not nothing, I think. And you look at the quality of the journalism that was produced by good faith outlets, then it's sort of remarkable in a way that journalists managed to do so much excellent reporting at a time when it was so difficult to move. But we also have populations that genuinely believe that the science is wrong, that are prepared to take to the streets on the basis of things which actually don't necessarily have any basis in truth. So that is also a challenge.
So how does the public react to the attack on the BBC? I mean, is there?
I think that's a really interesting question, because at a brand level, so if you talk about the BBC as part of a still largely London-based media elite, and there are stories again and the press is in the UK has an agenda. So Rupert Murdoch has a long-standing agenda against the BBC. The Daily Mail, which is the largest single daily newspaper and website, that's has a long-standing agenda against the BBC. So the sensationalist headlines about waste of public money, etc., that has destabilized a little bit the public view. But then when you talk about taking away very specific programs, people love them, and they love them much more than they love the government. They love them much more than they love any other British institution. So, a former colleague of mine in the British journalism was saying they should just make the announcement in the middle of the most popular show, which is Strictly Come Dancing on Saturday night, that they're taking it off the air because the government is cutting their funding. and there would be uproar. So I think it is that the relationship that people have with the BBC in the UK, particularly older people. So I think this is something else that, you know, we should talk about, which is the demographics of it. So particularly in the older demographic, the BBC, it's hard to it's hard to overstate how loved its programming and its place in British life, how important that is. But there's a new generation growing up that hasn't grown up with, sometimes not even with TVs in the house. I mean, if I ask my students who are in their mid-20s, who here owns a television? The vast majority do not own a television. They watch things streaming on their laptops or on their computers. And that, again, is, you know, a question about how do you imbue a new generation with the same level of loyalty and affection for something that you're going to ask them to voluntarily pay for at some point.
So, I mean, how does the BBC deal with the young audiences? Are they doing it fine, or are they failing?
No, I think they're failing. And that's again, it's not as simple as saying, in fact, they have the best children's production and the best children's television sort of anywhere in the world, really. They have invested an enormous amount of money in it. It's become, and to some extent, this is true of all other types of programming as well, just the strength of the BBC has turned Britain into a production powerhouse. Being Anglophone, speaking English obviously helps because America is the biggest market. But what's happened is that you now have the streaming platforms, the Netflix, the Amazon, etc. Production companies, independent production companies in Britain are doing phenomenally well. You know, somebody was telling me the other day that you just can't hire enough production people. You can't get hairdressers, can't get makeup people. Wow. So all of that is going into Amazon productions, Netflix productions, and young people are on their phones. They watch streaming services all the time, and the BBC has done. I think it's the quality of its production remains, but I think it really grapples with this problem of not being enough where the audience is, because in some ways you have to break with all of the traditional strategy sacred cows that the BBC was built on, which is you keep things on your platform and they're exclusively, you know, sort of that you have the iPlayer, you try and kind of create an island for yourself away from this other world. So I think that, you know, the distribution and visibility part of it is something that they struggle with the younger audience, but they're not alone in that. You know, anyone who's in the news organization is having exactly the same.
But so what's your hard question? What's your advice for the BBC on this question on how to reach the young audience on whatever platforms they are on?
So actually, weirdly, it's a very traditional piece of advice, which is I just think that you know, the history of the BBC is that it started out as an engineering project. And it started out as an engineering project with a desire to control airwaves from a centralized sort of government propaganda point of view. So it started in a very different place to the place it's ended up. But it's always had a tradition of really experimenting with and creating pathways in digital media faster than the commercial sector. So the BBC was building an iPlayer, which was like a video platform, before the majority of people were using Netflix, but it just didn't develop that, and it didn't grow in the way that it could have done if it had been a little bit more willing to open its doors to become a platform for others, or to think more broadly about content. So I think we've sort of passed, if you like, they've kind of passed the moment where perhaps that type of competition was viable for them, but not when it comes to production and creative thought and creation. And I really think, you know, they have to do what they do best, which is produce really excellent programs, not to chase just the big names and just the big salaries, but to find innovative, new, different voices, new artists, and keep investing in that, and keep investing in that in your domestic market, and creating really excellent production, because that is something that the streaming platforms are benefiting from, but they're not creating. They're not actually creating it at ground level. But I think that takes a real shift in belief. It really means that sort of you have to think we are going to be preeminent in producing a particular type of programming, which the BBC can absolutely do, and that is its culture. But doubling down on that, I think, rather than thinking, I don't think anybody at the BBC believes that competing with Netflix is a good idea. It's such a different model. But being the preeminent producer is completely within their grasp. It's hard when you're having your budget cut from every direction, but it's about creativity and grassroots, I think, fostering of all of this talent. Britain is really a creative economy. It's not a manufacturing economy. It's a creative and service economy, and they need to be the engine that drives that.
So, I mean, when we're talking about cutting the fundings, would there be any other? I mean, would there really be any other possibilities and financial arrangements that could work from your point of view? Because I read something about subscription models, which,
I think, I come from a background, I'm still sort of on the board of the Guardian, but I come from a background where I spent 10 years of my life persuading or really talking about why I felt it very strongly that the Guardian should not be completely behind a paywall. And I'm very proud that we are a digital news provider now, which is actually economically extremely viable, that doesn't charge for, puts everything out, pretty much everything out for free, but is still managing to charge for different products. So, I know that they always say, well, it's difficult, kind of with licensing and rights. I'm a British citizen. I live in the United States. I would pay quite a lot of money to be able to stream BBC services. It's more or less impossible to do. They don't make it easy. So even where there are existing possibilities of charging people for archive material, for streaming more of their programming, for perhaps owning more of their sort of audience, that relationship, I think that there are always relationships there that they can monetize. And the demand for their type of programming is not going away either. I think that the difficulty, if you like, is news. So if you looked at the core public service of the BBC and said, what is most important? I would say news and children's programming, because they set a sort of a cultural agenda, because you're not going to get external. And because these are things that you don't want left to a commercial marketplace, I think that that's really important to say as well. And those are, those are harder to, if you like, it's sort of harder to, I think, charge for that. And I'm not even sure that you should perhaps charge for it. I think that those things should be free. And the BBC, I think, needs to be, where I'd be critical of it, so I've praised it a lot, where I'd be critical of it is I think they really need to be much more imaginative about how they see their role in that world. And somebody's asking a question about the projects that the BBC have done in partnership with local news. I mean, I think it's good in theory. I just think it hasn't gone nearly far enough. I think that, there hasn't been a fundamental rethinking about what the BBC can provide services and platforms for, and what its role is in national life when the digital environment has changed so dramatically.
Okay. I just want to come back. I mean, what's from your point of view, the British and the US perspective, why is it important? I mean, you can see that I think it's important, but why is it important to have public service media or public service journalism?
Well, it's so interesting that when I arrived in the United States 12 years ago, one of the first pieces I wrote for the Columbia Journalism Review was about how it's interesting coming from Europe, and particularly coming from the UK, where there was a national conversation and there was a cohesiveness about focusing on what was important to everybody, that is completely missing from a market-driven model in the United States. And of course, what we've seen in the United States is 40 years of deregulation. So if you think about, actually, the media environment was reasonably heavily regulated in the United States at one time. It had spectrum allocation laws. It did have, the Public Broadcasting Act, it had the Fairness Doctrine, which I know is mentioned a lot about if you're occupying the spectrum, you have to give equal time to opposing viewpoints. All of that, and there are also very important rules about, in a very big country like this, who owns the local TV franchises, which is still where a lot of people get their news, and are those owners local? All of those regulations have gone, all of them. And you don't really have any regulation at all of the platforms. Section 230 famously allows platforms to moderate their own content in whatever way they see fit, without being liable to either keeping up or taking down certain types of material. So you're now operating in a completely deregulated environment. What has happened when you let the market loose is that you lose mission-driven local journalism, just disappears from so many markets. You have a polarized, increasingly shrill and divisive cable industry, which is really looking at being very oppositional. There's no mission in bringing people together, because the money is in actually dividing them. That's where the money is. And now it has reached a crisis point. So there is public media in the United States, but there's not a public media system. It's a framework whereby people give donations at will. But actually, the public service stations here that there are, the public broadcasters, the local radio stations, are now becoming actually quite seriously vital in how we might save certain aspects of local journalism here. But we don't have a public media system in the same way that many European countries do. And the reason that many European countries do is that post the Second World War, there was a real sense of, we have to create some sort of cohesion, and we have to invest in, information and national identities in a way that is more, educative and more inclusive. Without that, America is now experiencing a media crisis and a political crisis. I don't think that anybody here at the moment feels, and we're seeing moves in Congress for the first time, and in a way that I think people thought was unthinkable, to create subsidies and support, particularly for local journalism in this country. So everybody is looking to Europe, which again, I never thought would happen when I got here. So people are looking at the Digital Services Act, they're looking at the Online Harms Bill, they're looking at the model of public service broadcasting and saying, perhaps we've really underinvested in this in America. And that is why we have increasingly a divisive and often non-truth-based system. My worry is that actually the market is replicating more of the American system in Europe, that as we're sort of trying to retreat from this, excuse me, that Europe is experiencing some of the things that we've experienced over the past 5 or 6 years.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're having another question by Evgeny Dainov. He's asking about the BBC World Service. Actually, what happened to the World Service? What's your take on that?
Well, so I think the World Service is an interesting one because it's slightly different from the rest of the BBC in that it was funded by the Foreign Office as the kind of patrician news service that I think we now. So I was just thinking about this only yesterday because I was discussing with my students some of the real crisis that's happening in India at the moment. And we were reflecting on the fact that in American media, almost nobody has written or published anything about what is happening in India right now. And yet, they are on a path which looks as though it has the possibility to create, conditions for a really serious situation, maybe even genocide. And I was reflecting on what a role the BBC World Service would have once played in that. But, it came from a time when Britain was a much more colonial power, and that's not necessarily a good thing. I tend to agree, actually, with Evgeny that I would like more. I would like more news and analysis actually on the World Service. But like the rest of the BBC, they've also suffered restructure and funding costs, because that comes from a sort of slightly different part of government. So you can see, I think, through the World Service again, I think there are many good things on it, but that sort of hard analysis, lots of journalists in different parts of the world, that's been under pressure for some time, and eventually it shows up in the programming.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see some more questions, but I just want to add, you can also ask live and turn on your camera. So Brigitte, Biggie, do you want to ask, or shall we just read your question?
Yeah, I can ask that myself.
Yeah.
Emily, you mentioned the very popular dancing show on BBC. We have that in Austria too, of course,
right,
on our Austrian public broadcasting program. Do you think that this is the main task of public broadcasters? Because I prefer news programs and
yes,
talk shows and experts who know a lot about the world and can give me an insight what's going on behind the scene. What do you think about
well, so first of all, I agree with you, which is when you look at the core mission of public service broadcasters, what is it? Then it does come down to really trying to define market failure, which is what are the things that nobody else will do and nobody else can do because they have a different type of motivation. Their incentives are different. And I 100% agree with you that it is about news, current affairs, contextualizing things that are going on, giving populations trustworthy, timely information. But I'm not one of the people who says, just let the market do everything else. I actually think it is important that national broadcasters can have cohesive, popular programs which create a sort of a sense of unity and fun and a sense of participation. I think that if you lose all of that, and cultural life, I mean, you know, you're absolutely right, it's formatted television, but cultural life is really important too. The same issues come up with respect to sports. Is it important that the national football team is on a show where everybody can see it? Or should it be behind a paywall where you can only see it if you pay? I tend to think that it should be where there should be things that everybody enjoys that actually go. So the balancing act is not an enviable one. I don't feel envious of the Director General of the BBC, because I think you are going to have to pick. You're going to have to make choices. If you were left with Strictly Come Dancing and you got rid of news and current affairs because it was too politically difficult, then I think you have failed. I think if you get rid of Strictly Come Dancing, it's a shame, but it's not necessarily a failure.
Biggie, I forgot to ask you to introduce yourself. Biggie Handlos herself was a leading journalist at the Austrian public broadcaster. So.
Well, I feel I'm in complete sympathy. And I think when you see things that the market can do well, it's like, why should the public broadcaster do it? But I think you have to interrogate some of those questions and think about what's available, and also think about what's available for people who are never going to subscribe to Netflix, you know, that like my mother or whatever. And, you know, the disproportionate amount of sort of community and enjoyment that people get out of certain shows or schedules, I think don't, you know, in an aging population, we talk a lot about young people, don't underestimate how important that is.
Susan Perkins had a question in the chat. Do you want to turn on your... Can
you hear me?
Yeah, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, okay. Yes, I had a question so far. Thank you very much. You've been talking about everything from the side of the BBC, and now I'd like to ask about the other side of the coin. Is it still the fact that, let's say, a high-level journalist or someone who wants to make a career in journalism or reporting, is it still a popular place to work at the BBC? Does it still carry a lot of status? This is my question.
So yeah, so I think the answer is yes. I think it's a little bit of a qualified yes. So just personal kind of a personal admission. So my husband worked for the BBC for 10 years and then went to work for Financial Times. I have lots of friends who've worked as journalists at the BBC. I have lots of students who go and work at the BBC. The standard, the sort of the level of training that you get at the BBC, and crucially, I think the ability to just focus on journalism is something that not many places can offer. And so for that reason, it's still a really, I think, prestigious and good place for journalists to work. I think it's become more difficult for senior journalists perhaps to enjoy their careers there in the way that they once did. And I think there are various reasons. There's always been a tension within the BBC between, you know, journalists always want to do, journalists are the worst people in the world to manage apart from academics. And so that idea of you have a newsroom of people who are professional analysts and critics, and so they never seem that happy. You're never going to get a workforce saying this is amazing. But I do think that just some of the constraints placed on, I think the sort of the timidity of some of the management towards news management makes journalism more difficult. I think clarity of leadership in news is really important. We've seen some political clashes at the top of the BBC about appointments to managerial posts in the news. And I think those things can be actually quite depressing, particularly for senior journalists. And at the moment, I mean, I'm happy to say this, but at the moment, it's a pretty hot job market. You have the New York Times on, you know, hiring 20 journalists in London. You have expansion for the first time in, you know, 5 or 6 years, and in some sectors the first time in 10 years. Not necessarily in local journalism, but in high level professional journalism. Places like the Guardian that have found economic stability, as say, you know, kind of so I think that there is now more of a challenge. But the mission, I think, that BBC journalists have is really unique and special. And I still think that's very hard to replicate in most commercial organizations. And I think journalists know that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I forgot to sort of introduce myself. I almost hesitate to say it. I'm not actually a journalist. I hope you won't throw me out.
That's okay.
But I'm a freelance translator, basically from German into English, but also other possibilities. And I work mainly as a teacher, also freelance, not at schools, but at universities and what we call here in Austria Fachhochschulen, which are of applied sciences. So I'm originally made in England, but exported to Austria, and I'm still here.
Excellent. Well, teaching, finest of all professions. It's like knowing myself.
Thank you, Susan. Andy Kaltenbrunner, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Andy Kaltenbrunner, a researcher for Medienhaus Wien and the Austrian Academy of Sciences, having been a journalist for almost 20 years in Austria and other places, calling in from Spain today. So great what you told us, Emily, is that analyzes 2 interesting points and 2 questions for that. One was the idea of while the US is looking to Europe and thinking that something like public services might be interesting, whereas Europe is going the other direction. So, I mean, what might be the backing in Europe? If I see the situation now in the UK, the Boris Johnson idea is called something of a diversion, distraction from his own politics. But if this is so, this means there's a strong backing for that idea. Otherwise, he wouldn't do that. And we see from our data, from other research that, as one other thing you said, that during the pandemic, trust was really high for public services in almost all places in Europe, but it's going down again. So maybe we're on a point of transition, so the young audience is leaving again public broadcasters. So what's the takeaway from the pandemic trust, one thing, and is there some data maybe from the Tau Center which could teach us and tell us what's the backing of public services in different places?
Yeah, well, those are great questions. So we are mostly, by our funding, I'm afraid, we are mostly constrained at looking at the United States market. So what we are doing at the moment is some work on different models. We have a really capable senior research fellow who's involved in certainly looking at, we have a paper coming out in a couple of weeks on new and different models for public service broadcasting, which particularly focuses on the role here of public radio, which has high levels of trust, high levels of engagement, but only in certain sections of the market, and how partnerships with news and other news outlets could be actually something which forms a network that works, better than perhaps encouraging a full-blown startup culture and throwing away all the kind of legacy media things. So we're sort of asking some of those questions around current policy, which is on the stocks in the United States. I think it's really difficult and very different for Europe and America. They can learn very different things from each other. And one of the things that we do actually research a lot is certainly sort of journalism in the framework of and disinformation, and in terms of how the changing business models incentivize different types of information environments. And I think that that's where our work, to your second point, in a way, this sort of, I mean, when you said sort of if something's a bad idea, then Boris Johnson wouldn't be backing it. I don't think that's actually factually correct. I think that he's backed all sorts of things that have been terrible ideas. But that actually having a stable news environment and a well-informed public, one thing which we're learning is it doesn't actually benefit all politicians. And the model in the United States that we see is that you have lobbyists, you have what we call dark money, think tanks with different, particularly conservative agendas, pouring money into things that look like news outlets, but which are not news outlets. You look at the template for a new type of state media in Russia, say look at RT, which is essentially a propagandist outlet. And you're beginning to see an environment which is shaped in favor of a certain type of populist politician, whether it's on the right or left. This happens across the political spectrum. It happens sometimes on the left in, say, Latin American countries. And you see the formation of a new type of ecosystem of media outlets around that, which are pushing very specific agendas without disclosing funding, without disclosing, and they can do it again through social platforms which are targeted. It's really difficult to trace. I have incredibly talented computer scientists looking at some of these networks, and it's a lot of work and it's hard to establish, but it's pervasive, and I think that sort of the question is, when the political environment is actually suited by a really dysfunctional news environment, what should we who are concerned with pro-democratic institutions, pro-democratic press, pro-democratic government, how, what are the mechanisms and the structures that we can put in place to safeguard that? And public media, something which is supported but separate from the government, might be part of that. But we've got a very important year coming up. If you look at the midterm elections in the United States, if you look at Bolsonaro in Brazil, if you look at Austria, if you look at Hungary, if you look at France, your neighbors on either side, we have a lot of key elections happening, and that's not even talking about Kenya and places, sort of the big regional elections in India. It's really, really important, I think, to think about how media plays a part in that environment and what kind of regulation a democracy needs and what kind of media it needs to support within that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but those are the things that, you know, we look at both in sort of very granular level, but also at a higher policy level. And I think that in America, there's real alarm at the moment among people who are concerned that the Republican Party, which is, you know, a party that, you know, even those of us who don't necessarily affiliate ourselves with it, it plays a really important role in the global stability, because it's one of the main two parties in America, is heading towards a place where it's denying that true things are true. It's saying that violence is a legitimate form of speech. I think that, you know, these are really challenging times, and to pretend that the media environment has nothing to do with it is clearly wrong. But expecting governments to act in the right way might also be a fantasy, I'm afraid. If that makes sense.
That's
Sorry,
something we're afraid of in Austria too recently, but well, hoping that it might work out better.
Yes, well, so I think that this is it, that you know, we see this happening around the world, where you want democracy to be making progress, and what we've seen in many places, I mean, the Philippines also, there's an election this year, you know, many places it's actually slightly in recession, and I think that that's the thing, that we've woken up to that. You know, if you can have a sort of an insurrection in Washington, DC, you can have one anywhere. So if you've woken up to that, then you have to start to think about how you're going to put systems in place and build and invest in types of institutions that, you know, that persuade people to think otherwise. And that's a long project. That's not going to happen overnight by any means.
Thank you. Mirjana Tomic has a question.
Hello, my name is Mirjana Tomic. I'm a former journalist, and now I work with Daniela organizing seminars for journalists. My question is very simple. It's not exactly about the BBC. You mentioned several times market forces. Does extremism bring money? Yes, extremism is incredibly profitable. You know, so that's one of the problems that we have, is that populism. So actually, I tend to use an economic analogy in this when we talk about it. So in markets, there's something called Gresham's law. I mean, it's not really a law, but it's a principle, which says if you don't have regulation in a financial market, then bad money, unethical money, always drives out good money. Always drives out, you know, the sort of things which bring equity and fairness and equality of access. Because if you're operating with no borders, with no ethics, and with no constraint, you can always capitalize on the people who feel moral obligations and compulsions. And I think we're seeing that to some extent in the media market at the moment, that you know, a lot of what happens on Facebook has been, or on Twitter or through TikTok, or has been focused on and sort of criticized. I mean, and those platforms actually bring a lot of benefit as well. But the people who have monetized that really effectively are people who've sort of been excluded from markets previously, and they've been excluded because they would maybe breach broadcasting standards, or they've been excluded because they're trying to sell something which actually they wouldn't be allowed to sell, or they're funded by political interest groups and they never declare that. So I think that it is good for business, and actually that relationship between financial success for a very few, I mean, is it financially beneficial for the rest of society? No. It's actually disastrous. But can it be financially beneficial for the few who've got the system to work in their favor? Absolutely. And I think that's the one thing that we have really learned about tackling platform power, which is that you have to tackle it on an economic footing, and you have to regulate that side of it, probably more so than you have to sort of worry about, you know, the content, because sometimes those things are intimately linked.
Okay, thank you. There's another question by Francesca De Benedetti. Francesca, do you want to turn on your microphone and your camera, or shall we just read the question?
Okay. Hi. Thanks for organizing this really interesting talk. You can't see me because I'm in the newsroom, so I don't want to expose my colleagues.
No, that's very good. That's very good. Very good security practice.
Thanks, Emily, for your speech. I'm really interested in what you're going to say. I don't want to seem too nationalist in my question, but I'm wondering about the fate of the Italian public broadcasting. And so, given that the European Commission is working at a European Media Freedom Act, and given that the European Commission works on a competition basis, do you think that the EU could promote a privatization of public TVs? Given that you talked about the Americanization, I'm thinking about that, and how would you judge this scenario? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's really interesting. I mean, this is happening to some extent in the UK as well. So the privatisation of Channel 4, which started out as a sort of a public sector, but commercially supported part of the media ecosystem, which was encouraging production company startups. You know, the privatization of some of those assets, I think, is really troubling and worrying, because you will inevitably lose control of the ownership outside national borders. And I think it's one of those things where actually ownership of cultural assets does matter. You know, so I don't know the EU law or proposed law in detail. And I don't know kind of how, but I think that this is part of a narrative which is slightly constructed by the technology companies and bought into by a lot of publishers and broadcasters who would benefit financially themselves in the short term, which is, hey, look, you know, this is how the market operates now. You know, there's unlimited competition. You know, this is exactly the narrative that places like Facebook and Google span 20 years ago. You know, you've got an unlimited marketplace of competition. You now have what we call the GAFA companies, you know, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, absolutely dominating the market, the biggest advertising companies in history in Google and Facebook's place, in disrupting markets right the way around the world. And I think the idea that, you know, privatization is just an inevitable next step and will ultimately be better because that's the way the world is, just feels to me like an absolute denial of, you know, seeing what else is happening in the world. Now, I do understand that the EU, to give it credit, it's really the only competition authority in the world which is really thinking, I think, hard enough or seriously enough about what to do about tech company dominance. To what extent privatization is the answer to that, I'm really skeptical. I have to say, I think that, you know, kind of we're experimenting with so many things at the moment. One of the things that's really hard to reverse is privatization. Yeah, you know, the British did that with its railway system, and now everybody is surprised when the trains don't run, and you know, tickets are expensive and companies go bankrupt. So I'm slightly dubious. I think you need a balance between state support intervention or regulatory intervention, and you know, the free market can only ever be a small part of how you solve that problem, or, you know, never more than half.
Okay, there was another question, but you already answered it. You're going to post the link to your forthcoming study on the new models.
Yes, I said yes, I will do. Yes, when it's out. But
yeah. And so from this study, can we expect that you give us the perfect model also for the BBC?
No. One thing that I think academics should be accused of is we've invested, or rather there've been far too many studies in the past 20 years saying this is the perfect solution or that is the perfect solution. You know, I think that this is a really difficult long-term multi-stakeholder problem, and there are parts of it that have to be solved with competition policy. There are parts of it that have to be solved with cross-subsidy policy. I was talking to the Canadian government this morning about how they're going to restructure their press support, and how it might involve something that looks a bit like the Australian News Media Bargaining Code. So I think that idea of one model is perfect, but what I do think is really great is that for the first time, there is this global network now of people who are thinking and working on this problem and looking at the answers. And we're a tiny part of that, but we think it's very important work right now, because it stands a chance of making a difference at a critical time.
Mm. Miliana? Can't hear you.
Sorry, I have my second question since no one else has. You are a professor. You have young, brilliant students who made it to Columbia University. What do you tell them? Where do they look for information? What do they read? What do they see? And what do you tell them they should do?
So that's a great question. I taught my class last night. My class is called Information Warfare Reporting, where we try and teach, and I teach with a very talented former student of mine called Michael Keller, who's now an investigative journalist at the New York Times, who looks at AI systems and technology platforms. And one of the things that we talk about is, first of all, understanding the environment that we all now operate in, and how the changes to that inevitably change their role as journalists. We have an international class. So last night we talked more about India than we did about whether or not Joe Rogan should be on Spotify, which has completely dominated the American press for the past week. And what we tell them really is that the quality of their reporting is without doubt the single most important thing. And we were having a difficult discussion last night about, I have Indian students who are saying, we're on step 5 of 8 to genocide. What do we do? Everything, the government is silent. The airwaves are full of malicious, racist, inflammatory material. Almost what is our role in that? And, you know, what we tell them is, if you do your job, you know, doing your job, just reporting and putting new facts with integrity into the public domain is unbelievably important. Creating a reliable public record absolutely matters. And you can see with your own eyes what happens if that is abandoned. So so one of the things I would say about our students is, and yes, we have students from Austria, we have students from all over Europe, we have students from all over the world. What I would say about them is, yes, they're brilliant, but also they're so motivated, you know, that they can see that journalism isn't just a well-paid, cushy profession that you can become famous in. They're in our classrooms because they really, really, really believe that they can and should make a difference, and that they are fighting in a kind of, you know, they are fighting in an information war now, that they have to conduct themselves and think about their own role in that and be better than perhaps some of their predecessors. So I feel that's the one thing that actually just makes me incredibly optimistic every day, is seeing the energy for problem solving and the commitment to reporting. And this is why I'm very passionate about finding solutions that means that we can pay these people and that they can have healthcare, and that the innovation in journalism is making it once again a kind of a stable profession where the best people rise to the top, rather than perhaps, you know, the people who are not so well intentioned or motivated by public service.
Emily, actually, I wanted to ask you for your prediction for 27, but it would be so nice to end on this optimistic note. So
I'm quite optimistic about that. I kind of think that the BBC will be okay, because I think that nobody ever won an election by destroying the BBC. So I'm sort of optimistic about it. And also, I think it's a proof of the concept that, you know, people do value, they do value these institutions, and they do value the kinds of services that you can give them if you focus on high quality news, if you focus on high quality content. And the biggest danger to the BBC in some ways is itself. It can't lose that goal if it continues to operate at a high level. Then I feel that ultimately they will be successful in survival. The worry is if the pressure to be otherwise, to be less than perfect, will actually undermine them much more quickly than any single piece of legislation.
Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you.
This was excellent, and I'm looking forward to watch the talk on YouTube, so I can also listen and not only look at the.
These are great questions. It's so nice to be able to talk about these. So nice to be able to talk about these issues, and also to think that maybe we've had 10 years of, I think, quite depressing news in the news business, and it feels as though we have reached a point of crisis. And I do feel optimistic that we are all here talking about solutions and what we can do. And we recognize the problem now. We're no longer deluded about the market will fix it or technology will fix it. This is not going to happen. So I look forward to continuing the transatlantic debate. And thank you very much indeed, Daniela, for having me.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you for everyone for discussing and taking part in the discussion. And we will work together. Thank you so much. Looking forward to seeing you again.
Have a great day.
You too. Bye.